You've written a piece recently for the Institute of Art and Ideas, which caused some interest, and you make the case for revisiting the thought of someone who is mostly forgotten in the history of ideas, someone called Oswald Spengler. And I must say, I was not really familiar with his work until quite recently as well, reading a book by Matthew Rose. It's called The World After Liberalism. And the very first chapter is titled The Prophet, and it's about Spengler. So in what way was Spengler a prophet of our times, and why is it worth revisiting him in 2025?
Well, I mean, the first thing to note is you're absolutely right about him being forgotten. In fact, already by 1941, and I'll come to some of the dates, the significant dates in a moment, Theodor Adorno wrote about the forgotten Spengler. So if in 1941 he was forgotten, by our time he's well forgotten. There are lurking memories of Spengler for all of us, because perhaps all of us will have heard of the expression "the decline of the West," which is the English translation of his best-known book. So if there's some part of us which still hears it, it will hear it in that title, "The Decline of the West." Let's say something about what was forgotten then. The Decline of the West, as a 2-volume book, was written partly during the First World War. He claims to have made a start on it in 1911. But most of it was written 1912 to 1916, and that was published in a first volume in 1918, just after the First World War. And it was the most unlikely bestseller at least in the first half of the 20th century. And it's unlikely for so many reasons, but 500,000 copies of the first volume were sold, and Spengler went from being a lone thinker working in terribly impoverished conditions on a very small stipend left to him by the death of his mother, to some extraordinary fame. Everybody knew about Spengler. Everybody was writing about Spengler. Everybody in academia wanted to show how they could one-up on him. It was a particularly worthy effort. But he wrote this book, The Decline of the West. In German, it's Der Untergang des Abendland.
It's a more poetic title in
It
German.
is more poetic. Der Untergang is like downgoing, and Abendland is evening land. So it's like a sunsetting image, the downgoing of the evening lands. Also, one should consider that the choice of the title Decline of the West not only is less poetic, but it chooses the concept West. Abendland it could have said evening land, but that is a German expression and very much embedded in a German conception of world history already. But there were other choices available, that, for example, the Occident, as opposed to the Orient, West and East, Europe. Europe is the sort of significant geographical space of the Abendland. Anyway, it is. Let's forget. It's the downgoing of the Abendland, and the big thing, really, don't forget, because I think it's extraordinary, is Spengler thought that Germany was going to win the First World War. Spengler's writing this between 1912 and 1918, published in 1918, published with the title The Decline of the West, and he thought Germany was going to win. So it was sold 500,000 copies, perhaps because, against the background of the collapse and defeat of Germany in the First World War, there was this growing anxiety for Germany, about its position in the world, about what it had done and its failure and what was coming.
Yeah.
And the decline of the West really struck a chord there. And so
And,
there's a sort of strange setup for the bestseller.
and it strikes a chord today as well in some ways, because obviously we're also witnessing a moment of crisis, of lack of confidence, maybe in our present day democracies, you say, in European
Yeah,
West,
yeah.
whether what their future looks like. But so there's
Yes,
that. There's the fact that
let's
there's
look
this
at
kind of
that point.
prophecy almost that,
Right. So
echoes with us.
now we go into the prophetic moment, I think, because there is an extraordinary revision, a revolutionary revision of what had become the standard conception of world history for Europeans hitherto. There was really only one picture. He represents it in terms of a three-stage historical view, which goes from ancient through to medieval through to modern times, our times. And he says that we conceive this as a movement of progress, and not just progress for Europe or the Abendland, but in world history. So that's an idea of what's sometimes called a universal history of man, right? Where man is understood as this entity, this being that we supposedly are, whose being unfolds in time in a history of progress, of self-realization or emancipation, uh, some kind of liberation of the subject that we are in time towards an end, towards some final attainment of our own being. And that would have been understood as a rational being. So there was a standard philosophical history, the history of man, which is a history of progress, which is a movement from some primitive condition towards some modern condition. And Europe was supposed to be at the front of that movement of world history. That's the scene of the philosophy of history, but not just philosophy of history. It's the way Europeans understood themselves. Still do some. I mean, if you think of ideas of civilization, the civilization of man, it is still a picture of, originary primitiveness, moving through stages of development towards a scientific, rational, technological society and so on.
And you associate that view primarily with Immanuel Kant, or
Well,
as Kant as sort of
I mean,
articulating it in the most kind of explicit way.
perhaps Kant's a great figure in this, but Kant, Hegel, Marx, Husserl. I mean, just an endless line of absolutely central thinkers about world history, all of whom understood it as in some way a movement towards away from war, servitude, unhappiness, towards peace, happiness, and well-being, and freedom. So any kind of history which had this general shape was the standard picture for Europeans at that time.
And
Spengler just blows it out.
Yeah.
He just absolutely throws it out of the window and essentially says there is no such thing as man that has an aim or a goal or a progress or anything like this. That it's a complete phantom, he thinks. But he says if you get rid of the phantom, if you take off the lens of seeing history as this progressive movement from some primitive condition to some ultimately rational, civilized, free, emancipated end of history, if you take off that picture, you'll see instead, he thinks, a whole wealth of human forms of life in human cultures going back 3,000 years or more, where you see flourishing. He's got a list of the Egyptian, the Babylonian, the Indian, the Chinese, the Arabian, which he'll call Magian, and we can come back to that if you like, the Mexican, only one that got destroyed before it could even flourish by Europeans. the classical, that's the Greek-Roman, and the Western, the Abendland, which he also calls Faustian, which we can come back to as well. And he thinks that perhaps in the future that Russia could produce it. But you have this extraordinary flourishing of human possibilities all over the world, and they all, he thinks, take the same general form. And the general form is that they begin in a kind of state of primordial chaos without form, a formlessness, a sort of pre-cultural formlessness, which sort of comes together in a kind of unanticipatable way into a space that he calls the formation of a culture. And these cultures flourish and grow and develop on the basis of their own kind of characteristics, as they've maybe inherit things from others, but developing in their own way. And they produce these amazing cultural forms, incredible sort of bursts of creativity, culturally speaking, and their final flourishing, what they all produce, as it were, as their greatest creative moment, is a civilization. So each one of them is this sort of culture that produces a civilization. He quite often uses images of a flower. It's like a flower that grows and blooms. But what happens when the bloom blooms? Well, eventually it dies, right? And so he says of each of these cultures, or each of these great world cultures, they all last about 1,200 years. 1,200 years. Where are we? We, at the beginning of the 20th and 21st century, are in the last 200 years of the lifespan of a culture and civilization. So he's saying, you can deny it if you want, but this condition that you've arrived at is a certain kind of ending. It's the ending of the life of a culture turning into a kind of rigid form in its civilization, which he says they all get characterized across these different cultures in a very similar way. They become what he calls more or less democratic forms. They become urban, city life, bound up with conceptions of often with writing and the life of the intellect, and democratic forms of politics emerge, and eventually those democratic forms decay and collapse. They're exhausted. They have no life left in them. And he thinks that's where we are. And I think the prophet moment comes in, I would say, and I'll just put this to you, Alexis, see if it resonates with you or not, is whether in our time today, whether we can say with confidence that our present day democracies in the European West have a long and secure future. Is that how they look? It's like, they look robust, resilient, they stable, secure? Is that what we see in Western democracy today?
Yeah, well, obviously not, right? I mean, that's part of the reason why Spengler's kind of musings about the end of the West echo in our ears, and that's why we want to kind of have a closer look at his theory. Yeah. There are two things, though, right? That I guess I want to ask you. One, is that ever the case? Does a culture ever have that sort of full confidence in its future and the brilliance of its institutions, or is it always feeling like things are rather precarious? And if we go back through history, won't we find moments where we're always at this point where we don't know what's going to come next, and something does come next which isn't exactly the same as the present? And the other is, of course, to question this sort of idea of the sort of ending of civilizations and the rebirth of another one. I mean, you put the birth of Western civilization, according to Spengler, about 1,000 years ago.
That's in the year 1000-ish.
Yeah, but many would argue that, of course, Western civilization goes way back. We're the inheritance of the Greeks and the Romans, of Christianity, of the Judaic tradition, all those things. So there's a kind of continuity between a deep, deep past and the present, and there's no such thing as sort of a civilization dying an abrupt death and a new one beginning. So how would Spengler kind of deal with this objection about there
Yeah,
being a continuity with the past rather than breaks?
yeah. I mean, if you just pick apart the picture you gave, I would say that you described a conception of Western history, at least, that has the shape beginning in antiquity, moving through medieval Christianity into our time, and we'll see a structure of continuity from the Greek, Roman, Christian to the modern. Well, of course, that is exactly the picture he rejects for a start. And yet, as it were, for you, and not just for you, I mean, all of us really, it seems undeniable in a certain way. It looks like, but surely that was Europe's history, or the history of the West. Now, one really important thing to think there is there's something right there, that is to say that the West has understood itself in terms of that history, right? So the identity of the West is actually inseparable from its self-understanding of its own history, and we can't get away from that. The question would be whether that great discourse of world history that you've just described really is our history. And one of the features you said perhaps didn't have was some sense of its orientation towards the future of what was coming. Well, that is not really true. um, Insofar as the uh, vision of the movement of world history has the schema that you gave it, part of the idea is that there's a developmental sequence in view there, which is towards a kind of state of final flourishing. So, although, as it were, we're clearly not in a state of final flourishing, and perhaps one might say anticipating what the world will be like exactly when we do attain that is not given exactly. Nevertheless, it's conceived as a kind of movement towards an end of history,
Hmm.
a historical finality. Now, Kant, Hegel, Marx all certainly saw that. And one of the things that one might say about the 20th century, and postmodernists used to say this in the 70s and 80s, was that those old grand narratives of world history have become incredible. That is
Mm-hmm.
unbelievable. Now, it's a limitation of those postmodern thinkers in that they didn't know what to do with the fact that we had this picture and it's falling apart. And then what? And what are you supposed to think then? And I think, though, that the idea that prior, as it were, to its falling apart, we were also had no idea what was coming or lacked confidence about the general movement of progress. I mean, ideas of progress were pretty robust. It's not like that we were sort of in some great anxiety about whether things were going to get better. The movement of uh, uh, prosperity and democracy through the 18th and 19th century did give Europeans a very strong sense that they were part of a historical movement that was bound up with historical progress.
Yeah, and things, of course, did get better since then, quite significantly. I didn't want to get into
For who?
objections. Well, I mean, for people living
Yeah,
in Europe,
yeah,
yeah.
indeed.
I didn't want to get into objections quite yet, but since
Okay.
we're sort of talking a little bit about this or dancing around this idea, let's kind of prod it a little bit. So the objection that Spengler has is that basically, we had these histories of philosophies of history of teleology, and those presumably Spengler is rejecting those on empirical grounds. They don't quite fit. If you go back in history and read it, it doesn't quite fit that picture. And I wonder whether what Spengler is doing is, in some ways, falling in the mistake of replacing a teleology of progress with a teleology of doom and decline,
Mm.
right? And this is something, again, that's very familiar. We've had talk about the end of democracy, the end of the West for quite some time, the very least in the last 10 years since, the Brexit votes here in the UK and Trump's first election in 2016. There were a bunch of books around that were kind of spelling the end of democracy or liberalism as we know it. You say in your piece that Spengler is inspired by Nietzsche and his critique of Kant and Hegel and all these kind of ideas of a universal man. But doesn't Spengler sort of take the wrong ideas out of Nietzsche? Doesn't Nietzsche open history even more, or rather than say that, well, it doesn't have this structure, it has this other structure, this kind of naturalistic structure of birth, flourishing, and then decline? Wouldn't Nietzsche say that, well, history is actually much more contingent, everything is more or less open, you can't really predict what's going to happen in the future? So yeah, where does Spengler sit between that kind of Nietzschean view?
Well, where he is squarely with Nietzsche is when Nietzsche says things like the attempt to read reason and divinity into history fail, right? So that they're together in the rejection of a conception of world history as the unfolding of reason in time, or to conceive that the same thing as what's sometimes called providential history. That's God's plan for man. And in fact, I think one of the most powerful parts of both Spengler and Nietzsche's view is that critique of classic philosophical history, where that rootedness of our ideas of progress, including Nietzsche and Spengler will say Hegel and Marx, are deeply rooted in a Christian vision of the movement of what's called an eschatological history, like a movement to end times in which there'll be some kind of redemption for fallen man. So you have an attempt to read divinity into history. Obviously, that's dropped in Marx, but nevertheless, it remains an attempt to read reason into history, at least in the sense of we're going to move towards a more rational way of being. The second thing that Nietzsche says that Spengler will agree with is when Nietzsche says mankind does not advance, it does not even exist. And that second step is very important to Spengler in his turnaround vision. So from an idea of a universal history of man advancing towards the end of man and the end of history, you just have these singular individual cultural forms that arise, flourish, and die. Now you're saying, but why should we suppose it will die? Or should we suppose that it always has the same kind of shape, sort of some kind of inevitable movement towards decline? Well, let's say, first of all, that he does think that. And
why does he think that? Does he think that on empirical grounds, or is it some kind of, again, replacing one kind of metaphysics with another, like a more naturalistic, say, metaphysics of birth, growth, death?
Yes, it's an organicist conception of development in which you see something like birth, maturation, ripeness, death. Yes, he does absolutely see that. And you could say, well, Nietzsche doesn't have to buy that kind of vision, but the parallels remain beyond Spengler's insistence on the organic metaphor. For example, what happens after the death, the decline of a civilization? That's not the end of the story, right? So it's not a teleology because actually there's a continuation. I've only just told you the first two steps, right? The first step is the birth of a culture. The second step is the formation of a civilization. Well, that's not the end. There's no telos, right? Because it doesn't end there. It carries on. It collapses. And here comes the great sort of second big hit from the forgotten Spengler, what takes the place of the, for us, a democratic modernity is what he calls the return and rise of Caesarism. Okay, so he's looking at Julius Caesar as supplying a model for the continuation of the sequence, culture, civilization, into whatever comes next. He calls it an age of Caesarism. He thinks we are, roughly speaking, between times. So we're in the phase of the collapse of democratic modernity and the beginning of the rise of the age of Caesarism. Now he's writing this now, 1918 published, 1922, the second volume published, where he's talking about the age of Caesarism. And he will live to see Lenin, Stalin, Mussolini, Hitler, all coming up. Now, he all thinks they're all in a certain way not yet Caesars. They're all sort of on the way towards what we're going to see with the rise of a Caesar, but they are, as it were, Caesar-like. And it was precisely this that Adorno picks up. He says, Spengler will get his revenge by the forgotten Spengler will get his revenge by being proved right. And what he'll be proved right about is the rise of the age of Caesar, a new Caesar. And of course, that is a dimension of our current situation where if you, as it were, return to a Spenglerian conception of the movement of world history, what you will expect to see in the space left vacant, as it were, by the collapse of the resilience and life of democratic forms, particularly parliamentary forms, for us is the rise of the strongman, the Caesar, and you know that's a second point in which one looks about and you thought, well, that looks quite plausible, and it's in Nietzsche too. Just to fold those two together, no teleology in Spengler. There is a sequence of development, and it's the same sequence you see in Nietzsche too. Thinks we move towards a kind of post-democratic spiritual tyranny, he calls it, or tyranny of the most spiritual sort. Not a kind of a tyrant monster, but actually a creative force who, in the absence of a great culture, can produce events of government of state-like capacity.
You said that. I mean, so Spengler dies in 1936, and you say, well, he witnessed a lot of these sort of baddies of the 20th century.
Yeah.
Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin. I mean, one objection is, well, okay, that sounded very plausible, looked very plausible as kind of the rise of Caesarism. These people are, authoritarian dictators and spell disaster in many ways for their countries and for Europe. But we're, on the other side of that, we survived. Europe survived all those characters and in some ways came out stronger. The European Union was created as a result. War now in Europe seems a lot less likely than it did 100 years ago. Are we really to believe that, if Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin, Franco, all these people didn't manage to do the job, Europe will die in the hands of Orban and Le Pen and Farage?
I wouldn't say that, and I don't think actually, incidentally, that Spengler would either. You note that he died in 1936. In 1933, he wrote perhaps his most significant second work. There are others which we could talk about, which I think are all interesting, but it's called in English "The Hour of Decision." Again, somewhat problematic title translation. The Hour of Decision makes it sound like now is a time that something decisive is happening. He thinks that this decisive period is over decades, perhaps over a century, and that this is this between ages time where he's looking at decisive movements within European and world history. And he is one of the things he's absolutely clear about is in this development, as he sees it, we're moving into a post-nationalist condition. And there's something very like the anticipation of the European Union going on there. So that he says in this phase of the next 100 years, so it's 1933 up to 2033, you'll see waves of these fascist and nationalist and authoritarian events, political events. But ultimately, the movement is towards one in which he says nationalism will disappear. And one has to kind of think, what on earth is he imagining there? And it's not incredible to suppose that the sort of thing he sees there, because of exactly what he does say, is some kind of forged unity amongst a hitherto fragmented Europe. This is also in Nietzsche, incidentally. The chapter on peoples and fatherlands in Beyond Good and Evil is all about a movement beyond fatherlandishness in Europe, where Europe wants to become one. And I think Spengler also sort of anticipates this movement, but he still thinks that within that space, created indeed, as you say, to make war less likely between these hitherto almost constantly warring states in Europe, this movement towards peace is not going to lead to some Kantian vision of global pacification, not at all. And if the European Union thinks it's standing on the brink of global pacification, well, I mean, they'd have their head in the sands, because it's exactly not happening. Now, what happens in these conditions of conflict? And I think Spengler and Nietzsche both think that challenges, particularly from Russia, both of them saw Russia as a principal kind of antagonist within the next 100 years of European politics. Incidentally, neither of them saw China. Spengler sees Japan as potentially having a regional role, but anyway, Russia is the sort of big beast on the horizon for both of them. But this challenge from Russia constantly, both of them seeing, and especially Spengler, seeing Russia as constantly attempting to undermine Western unity through propaganda. So they don't have a lot of weapons, but their propaganda is just like awesome, and they will flood you until you sort of basically dissolve yourself in the scum that they've just been throwing at you. So awesome pictures. But yeah, so yes, the formation of the European Union, but Alexis, you have to be very careful that your argument doesn't go. I mean, you could go where you like, but one direction that had gone in, you may remember, is in the fall of the Berlin Wall, in the wave of optimism there, was an idea of a new end of history, that liberal democracy was the end, the Fukuyama-style end of history, which itself regarded itself as the inheritor of Kant, Hegel, Marx. It was the end of the line of this kind of visions of a teleoeschatology, a teleological vision of world history that would end in liberal democracy and the formation of an increasingly peaceful world. You're absolutely right to say war has become less likely, and exactly words I would use too, in Europe. To suppose that means that war is less likely, fantasy, right?
Sure.
Right.
Can I ask you about that book a little bit, the Hour of Decision?
Yeah.
So there are two things that sort of remain questions for me. One, it sounds like Spengler isn't a sort of fatalist. He doesn't think that this is inevitable and that there is something to be done. In which case, sort of there's not sort of an inevitable decline, that something can be done to either delay the decline or preserve something post-decline.
Yeah.
So that's one question. The other is, what does he want to preserve? What is he? Because Spengler isn't considered to be a sort of liberal Democrat, right? He's not concerned about liberal values and maybe not even necessarily democracy. What is it that he thinks is so kind of key to the idea of Western civilization that he wants to sort of warn and therefore try and preserve?
Well, that's a great question. I get the feeling that in his work there is a task to go down with the ship, right? So it's not about keeping the ship afloat, because that's not, that is, say, the historical formation of the European West. That is not going to revive and produce a new great future for itself, in as it or a continuity of itself, or a kind of continuing of itself. What you can get, though, what he seems to present is a picture of what, as I call it, going down with the ship. Now, there's a kind of cartoon version of this, which is not him. The cartoon version is the captain who stands at the prow saluting as the ship sinks. That's, I mean, there is a kind of going down with the ship going on there, but that's not what he meant. Going down with the ship means you try to save people, or, you know, if you're on the Titanic, you're doing everything you can to get people off and get people on rafts, and make a kind of new movement beyond the collapse of what was there. And he thinks that there's a promise or possibility of a future beyond the collapse that will take Europeans, in this case, actually becoming subjects of history and not just objects of history, is the way he puts it in The Hour of Decision. If you could just like become overwhelmed by whatever's happening. One of the things that he thinks will happen, he wasn't alone in this, is that the peoples of the world who've been absolutely humiliated by white Westerners since the 15th century, they're not going to kind of come and save you. On the contrary, they'll just like, they'll let it burn in the end. So he sees no kind of pleasant journey in a movement of world history where Europe is kind of sustaining itself in a space where it's surrounded by friends. It's surrounded by people who really have had enough, right? So what's his position? Well, he calls it Prussian socialism, right? Now, we could spend a long time with that, because he certainly spent a long time with that. In The Hour of Decision, he says, we're going to have to put more emphasis right now on the Prussian bit than the socialist bit. But Prussian socialism for him is an ethical position which aims to create a political economy which transcends, what he says, transcends all class distinctions. Right, so that's his socialist vision, an ethical socialism that will transcend all class distinctions. And it would be one very much in line with Nietzsche's vision of, in fact, what Nietzsche called a democracy to come, where the ruling regime tries to secure for each as much independence as possible in their opinion, way of life, and occupation, in that threefold way. So instead of a democracy of the herd, where it's all leveling equality, it's a democracy of singular difference. And this is ethical socialism. And the Prussian part means you are aggressively defending this. It's not about a kind of everybody's going to be really nice and it will be really easy to unfold this future for ourselves. And indeed, he thinks that in the wake of the collapse of democratic modernity, in what he thought of as the political party form of politics, there wasn't like an alternative to Caesarism. Like, you couldn't say, well, let's oppose this Caesarism with something else. He said you either work in the historical movement or you just get buried by it. That's it.
So you have to, yeah, try and pick your Caesars wisely, as
exactly.
it were.
And in fact, a lot of his critics around him when he was alive and not much beyond were saying, you're expecting a lot from these Caesars, right? You're expecting exactly what Nietzsche calls these spiritual tyrants, and
not quite what we're getting at the moment.
not exactly, yeah, no, not at all. I don't think so. Not even glimmers of it, to be quite honest. And he really didn't see it in Hitler too. It's an extraordinary, they did meet, and he thought he was a clown and would have nothing to do with him. And Goebbels came to him and said, will you give speeches? He said, absolutely not. He said, and of course, Hour of Decision got banned by the
Mm.
Nazis. He wasn't
Yeah.
popular.
If we have more time in the Q&A, maybe we can talk about his sort of ambiguous relationship to the far right.
Oh yeah, because he calls himself a thinker of the right,
Yeah,
right? So
yeah.
he calls himself a Prussian socialist on the right.
Yes, and he has various concerns about immigration that have again strong echoes today. I want
I'm
to
not
be
sure
my
about
my
that.
final
Oh yeah,
question. I want to ask you about this objection that you bring up, which comes from Derrida, which
oh yeah.
is that maybe you know in the echoes of this kind of postmodern rejection of grand narratives and teleology, to say that, well, maybe that we've been thinking about the European project in the wrong way. It's not that we have a sort of like arc of history that gets us somewhere, but that the European project and democracy in particular, maybe democratic politics, is a sort of never-ending project. It's a kind of regulative ideal, something that we're always
We won't
trying
call
to
it
get
that. That
to.
was so good up to that point. Let's hold off regulative ideal, but
Okay.
let's call it Faustian, right? So one of the things I said about Spengler's conception of the culture of the West, of the Abendland, is that he calls it Faustian after Goethe's
Hmm.
Faust, and he represents the sort of, as a kind of image of this culture, is one that's always trying to go beyond itself. It's kind
Hmm.
of limitlessness, a will to go beyond. And what's crazy about Spengler for me is that he ties the idea of democracy up with democratic modernity and parliamentarism and produces no Faustian movement in it at all. Why can't the European idea of democracy be precisely conceived in a Faustian way as one that is constantly leaving open the possibility of going beyond itself? Some movement, I mean, even parliamentary elections are a bit like that, where you get the replacement of one government by another.
Hmm.
So you have but even much more profoundly than that, Derrida certainly wants to argue that our idea of democracy includes within it the idea of creative political thinking in the future, right? So that instead of us now anticipating what an ideal democracy would look like, as if we could sort of prefigure the whole of history and the whole of democratic history now, he thinks no. Instead of that idea of a kind of from now anticipated final end of democratic history, precisely as you say, has no end. It's not because there's a sort of regulative ideal that we're following that it'll go uh, towards and never reach an
Never
end.
get there. Right.
It's much rather that there's a kind of radical leaving a void in itself for thinking yet to come. And
Hmm.
so Derrida says that democracy is like a shorthand expression for democracy to come. And he also says, and people might rankle at this, but he calls this the European idea of democracy. And I'm saying, well, let's call it then the Faustian idea of democracy, and hit Spengler with his own theory. And I always,
Hmm.
Adorno also liked this idea, trying to sort of provide a kind of immanent critique.
Hmm.
I think he found it very difficult with Spengler. He admired him enormously, but he didn't want it to be true. Um, but I think you can, yes, I think you can produce for yourself a future for democracy beyond the democratic modernity that um, Spengler sees becoming increasingly lifeless, without stepping into the Faustian moment. And I think that's in Nietzsche. So that's the point where I get the two of them apart. It's not that Nietzsche thinks that there's in a non-organicist way. It's rather he thinks that there could be another democracy, or a democracy to come. And I'm keen on that idea.
Thank you very much for that. Let's get to the Q&A because there are lots of questions, and let's try and get through a few of them. Brooke Maddox says, I'm thinking of Heidegger's concept of history, culture, and time as I listen to you. Did they know each other? How does their thinking relate, in your
Oh,
opinion?
that's such a good question. I've got a PhD student working on this at the moment, I must tell you, and it's a frighteningly brilliant maze of complexity. They didn't meet, um, but in the texts which are published as the Black Notebooks, Heidegger's Black Notebooks, which are troublingly private, but they're called ponderings properly. And Spengler's a regular interlocutor for, for Heidegger, and until the end, it's an interlocutor he wants to trash. He thinks, I think he's personally, I think he's slightly envious of Spengler's success and popularity, but more importantly, Heidegger retains the significance of the human, qua human, obviously understood as Dasein in Heidegger, that there's our being is to have being in the world as our basic state. We have this relationship to being. None of that's in really in Spengler. Spengler talks about us as the beast of prey, the predatory animal, the armed hand. It's all about a kind of anthropology and the anthropology of the human, which diversifies in this plurality. And Heidegger just doesn't go with that at all. However, on the last, second, well, penultimate page of the last pondering notebook, he says something and then says, there is no purpose left to take the field against Spengler. He reconciles himself to an idea of the decline of the West, of the Abendland, which he does see as unarguable. But he continues to see the possibility of this new eruption in the German world of a new kind of resonance with being and or communication with being that is nothing in Spengler. However, they come together again, even in this moment of difference, because they both believe to the end that the future is German. I said earlier on that Spengler wrote The Decline of the West in conditions where he thought that Germany was going to win the First World War, and he refuses to accept that it was ever really defeated. And he thinks that there will be 200 years of German history to come in which Germany will play a world significant role. That's what the hour of decision is about. And when he projects this European space and says there'll probably be a common language, although nothing particular will hold on it, he says it in an abstract way, but I think he thinks it would be German. And Heidegger, too, thinks that the future history of the world depends on a German intervention. It's very striking. What can you do? I'm not German. I love Germans, but I can't go there.
Yeah, perhaps the trap of this sort of cultural relativism, particularism that Spengler has, sort of like,
Yeah,
it makes it
but
hard
it's
for
not
him to
German.
escape it.
For neither of them is it statist.
Mm.
They're not thinkers of Germany as a nation state that will play a powerful role in geopolitics, for example. They're both, well, in Spengler's case, he's a profoundly proud German. And there's something in Heidegger which is this sort of absolute world significance of world historical significance of the German language.
Mm.
So they're not sort of ridiculous nationalistic figures. The opposite in some way. It's very odd.
Roger Paxton has a question about the idea of historical cycles and how relevant they are in the era of climate change and ecological catastrophe,
They're good.
which appears likely to end most of human life, not just particular human civilization. So Spengler's history of cycles not really made for the 21st century when climate change, or maybe nuclear weapons. I see the following questions about nuclear weapons as well.
There's an astonishing passage in his little book Man and Technics, where he says, looking ahead, in a few decades, most of the great forests will have gone. Climatic changes will be set afoot which imperil the land economy of whole populations. Innumerable animal species will be extinguished, or nearly so, like the bison. Whole races of humanity have been brought almost to vanishing point, like the North American Indian and the Australian. All things organic are dying. This is 1931. He's anticipating climate change, global catastrophe, absolutely inseparable from Western technology. And he does think that this is going to bring a kind of absolute sort of state of universal annihilation for human beings, and that there is no serious way out of that. So he will again remain like, for people say, we can overcome this situation and move in a more positive direction. He just said, no, this is just what is happening.
Well, he has that line, doesn't it? Hope is cowardice.
Yeah. Optimism is cowardice.
Optimism, yeah.
And Nietzsche too will say, this we've come to realize that becoming, that's history, aims at nothing and achieves nothing. And we might give ourselves a meaning, some kind of meaning, he says, if we think we're going to destroy the world. At least destroying it would be doing something. It's like, oh God. But I actually don't think Spengler did anticipate a kind of really fundamental global collapse. And it was precisely because of the domination of the West across the globe. It had spread itself and its technology worldwide. And that worldwideization, that globalization, produces conditions of global collapse.
Why is that? I mean, not to take time from our other questions, but does he see something wrong in the very idea of globalization, of one culture sort of like dominating all others and kind of
that's
having
our
this
Faustian spread,
fake
right?
Universalism? Yeah,
it's the Faustian vision that wants to go beyond all possible boundaries. But what produces destruction is the machine, and he sees that instead of the machine being something in the service of the human, we become its slave, and it's just going to sort of overwhelm everything. You get all organic life can't survive in the face of this kind of inorganic monster.
Speaking of technology and inorganic monsters, Tom Heaney asks, do you have thoughts on the Silicon Valley AI vision of algorithmic decisiveness, or Peter Thiel's latest worries about the Antichrist? How does all that ring with Spengler's thought?
I think that's a very interesting question, whether there is an ontological space being opened up by thinking about AI for which there's almost no room in Spengler. It's either organic or mechanical. And is ChatGPT mechanical? Not clear that it's simply so, nor is it obviously organic. And one can then think about the relationship between technology and the human body as itself, in a way, apparatus of a certain kind. I must say I'm only at the beginning of thinking about this. There's an event at the LSE tomorrow with a great thinker called Yuk Hoi, who is saying that we must incorporate the thinking of technology if we're going to understand world history today. I don't want to talk about Peter Thiel, not interesting.
Tom Iopolo asks whether Spengler anticipated the loss of fertility in Europe as a symptom of decline. Obviously, our demographics, demographic trajectory. And I did mention this earlier. Didn't hear what you said about immigration, what his views about immigration were, and the decline of Christianity.
I haven't seen anything about immigration. I have seen a lot about collapsing fertility. But also one of the things that we haven't got time to talk about, but it's something that Adorno thought was absolutely fascinating, is that although Spengler wants to give a conception of human forms of life in terms of race, he has, as Adorno puts it, absolutely nothing to do with the race theories of National Socialism. He is utterly opposed to what's generally now called biologism or zoologism, where race is conceived as a sort of natural form of human existence into different types. And when Spengler talks about this, he says that any conception of race which takes its point of departure from anything that is visible in a corpse is absolutely worthless. And if you think about race thinking today, what isn't? Isn't it precisely characteristics of the human being that are visible in a corpse that dominate thinking of race today? And he thought that that was an absolute disaster. And he said, and I love this, and we'll maybe have to almost finish with this sort of stuff, but he says the purest expression of race, bearing in mind that there is no pure expression of race, the purest expression of race is a house. Wow. That is the integration of place and life. The way in which that there's a sort of symbiotic relationship between how one emerges in a form of human life and the place in which that is located. And he thinks, as indeed do a lot of people, that technological modernity produces a kind of deracination of life, not just for Europeans, but for all human beings. There's a sort of racelessness that emerges through the homogenization of all existence on the earth through technology, which is a kind of flattening out of placelessness. And there's no going back either, really. But race for him has nothing to do with the color of your skin. So he would
It's
not
all
be
cultural for him, the cultural
well,
differences.
it's not cultural exactly either, because it's pre-cultural. It's not like what you've got to defend is the Judeo-Christian culture or some absolute nonsense like that. For him, race is much lower level of sort of category of existence, but crucially would have nothing to do with your skull shape or your nose shape or your eyelids or your skin color, anything. Yeah. So I'm not sure what he'd say about immigration. He says it's always been the welcome of the other in every culture. Except, we can also do the opposite when you get stupid ideas of race.
Simon Glindening, thank you very much.